of the way? No. And I just had the information right there. Yeah. I covered it up. Our checking account, we've got $28,767.33 in it. Our money market fund, we've got $25,115.49 for a grand total of $53,882.82.
All right, that's good. We're gonna use that in any opposition we have to Republican county in this county. If we need to.
Do we have a motion to approve that? Motion.
Get a motion to approve the report.
So,
Okay, motion.
second.
Motion second. All in favor, let it know, say aye.
Aye.
Thanks. Good to see you.
Yes, sir. So y'all looking at Bible and a half, y'all may not know is, Mom and Daddy lived here in Calhoun County back when I was in law school. Daddy worked for chalk line, remember downtown, and said Mom worked for Jim Nolan, the old company business. So I got a connection here, so maybe that's one of the reasons why you might see a little bit. But it's always good to be able to come back. I know they love living here, and it's a great community and one that they appreciate an awful lot. I will tell you that this time of year is when I think of Anniston. And it's for the very reason that Henry got up and talked about just a second ago. A little bit about my background, 26 years, Lynn, longer than you, I think. Working with law enforcement, the greatest professional blessing in my life. And there is no other community in the state that recognizes and supports law enforcement more than you do in Calhoun County. And I think, number one, it's a reflection of the fact that you don't buy into some of this national narrative that was out there for a while, that criminals are the victims and the police are the criminals. You understand, and you said it better than I can say it, the value that law enforcement brings to this community. I think it's a wonderful testament to Calhoun County that monument to our fallen officers sits right there in the middle of town. And one of the best events every year is going to take place there in, I guess, a week and a half, where you honor what I believe will be three new names that go on that wall. And every year when I come back, I go to touch one of those names, a guy named Earl Leemaster, who was police chief in Grant, which was in Marshall County where I was the DA. Was killed in a line of duty by two 17-year-olds who run away from home. He was just there to pick them up and take them back to their families, and they shot him and took his wife. And I can tell you it was a life-changing moment for me. Number one, and I hope we never face this, although I know y'all had to deal with it here when you were assistant. Is that not only did I understand the grief that took place in the community when we lost someone who's willing to risk their lives for total strangers, which is what law enforcement does. But y'all, I never understood the bond and the brotherhood that exists in the law enforcement community. There were people that came from Los Angeles Police Department, from New York City Police Department, to Little Grant, Alabama, to be able to show their respects to that community and that family. And y'all, it's what taking from that moment moving forward about the joy and the privilege that Lynn and I are given, not only to speak on behalf of victims, but also on behalf of law enforcement. And the fact that you honor the men and women of law enforcement through lunches and through gifts is a reflection of how much you value the work they do. Because I can tell you, Bill Partridge didn't get into this to get rich. If he's rich, y'all need to tell me because I need to look at it. But Calhoun County has a rich heritage of remarkable law enforcement leadership. Bill's one of those. Is not only in this community, but around the state and around the nation that people call to get guidance. Y'all had an amazing line of sheriffs, no pressure, right? Of the value. Matthew was the head of the Sheriff's Association when he left to be able to go retire. But you've had many that have come through the ranks that are leaders at a national level. And y'all, again, I think it's because you value the work that they do and very much appreciate it. So next week, you'll have family members that will come here that will be honored because their own family members gave that ultimate sacrifice. And I thank you for the fact that you're willing to look at the law enforcement officer and be able to say, thank you for what you did. Because, again, it's not what they're seeking, but I can tell you it is that affirmation for local individuals that they're willing to risk their lives for that keeps them every day being able to come back to work. I tell them all the time that one of the beauties of being in the profession, and it is a profession, is that they have a legacy that lives long after they've been in that job. And it's because of those lives that they've changed for the better and been able to do so. So anyway, sorry to get on that tangent, but thank you for leading us all. All right, everybody here loves a little history, I hope. I do want to take a moment to be able to remind us what this year is. Everybody, I think is familiar, 250 years. We're going to celebrate as a nation. And y'all, when for 4 years, anybody got a little bit of whiplash shot away in the first 100 days? And who would have ever thought that Donald Trump and Elon Musk would come together the way they did? I couldn't believe that. But we've seen order after order coming from this administration dealing with what we had heard coming on for the last 4 years. But one of which questioned the value of the family of our country. And y'all, let's think a little bit. Remember these words, written by Thomas Jefferson at 33 years of age. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What a remarkable vision for what this nation can be. And y'all, I can tell you as we listen to those words, a reminder of what this nation is supposed to be about. Because in some ways, this is going to sound a little strange. COVID was a good thing. Now, not the loss of life, not the tragedies within families, but it was an exposure to the very thing that our founders dealt with Britain. This idea of we should live in a nation where you have the consent of the governed for our government to be able to work. And y'all, we saw, it was interesting today, as for timing, the president signed an executive order today relating to gain of function period, right? We know that. Remember the COVID vaccine and kind of where that came from and where we now think the origin of the COVID virus truly was. But think about what COVID exposed for us and why I think it has motivated many of the people in this room, Republicans across this country, that ultimately got Donald Trump elected, is to be able to push back against some of the policies that we saw coming from the Biden administration. I'll talk a little bit about what we've done. But, you know, the Declaration of Independence really was kind of like, for Lynn to start a case, she has to issue what's known as an indictment. For the judges to be able to evaluate cases that come before them, they have to know what the allegations are. What Thomas Jefferson did was write an indictment through the Declaration of Independence of what was going on from British rule into the American colonies. And not only did they make that indictment of the king, but they also set up the framework for what this country was ultimately going to be about. Initially through articles that didn't work real well for the first several years because there was no national umbrella for the federal government to be able to work. But we ultimately get a constitutional framework with the adoption of our Constitution, with a Bill of Rights that includes multiple amendments that we value, including the First Amendment, religious freedom, freedom of speech, both of which were attacked in the other prior administration. Then also this provision that doesn't get looked at enough, that's the 10th Amendment, which defines this idea that the federal government has power, but they're limited. That it's the states that truly have the ability to exercise the principles of democracy, and that other than those designated powers to the federal government, it's the state's responsibilities to be able to act. You know, one of the unique privileges you give me, not only to be able to work with law enforcement, and I value immensely the title of Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the state, but it is also to be able to push back and defend Alabama's sovereignty. The laws that we pass And in the areas in which the states have the authority to act as opposed to the federal government, because when we hear about the deep state bureaucracy, when we see agencies trying to legislate regulations and otherwise Congress didn't give them the authority to act, man, you can appreciate that in the business that you're in, what you have to deal with. That you give me the responsibility and the authority to say, we're not going to stand for that. Y'all, look, if you ask me whether or not it ever bothered me to sue Joe Biden, no, it didn't. Right? That was a unique privilege given to me. But the big thing that I can tell you is that on the issues that we worked hard on, we were successful. The good thing, and I'll shift gears in a minute, is that the perspective has changed a little bit. And what we're going to be able to do is support the administration. And I want to highlight for you a couple things that we've been fighting about that I think matter to the administration. Before I do, let me brag real quick on your legislative delegation in this most recent session, because Chief, you and Lynn can disagree with me, but I think we've had more productive criminal justice laws in this one session alone than any time that I've been. They have passed bills to give law enforcement additional penalties to go after the bad guys who do bad things with guns. They have before them now the opportunity to be able to pass what we refer to as a speedy trial bill to give us greater resources in being able to get our violent crime cases through to the point of trial. And they have stood strongly to be able to say, we're going to back law enforcement in the efforts that they're using to be able to keep communities safer. So, gentlemen, thank you for the work that you're doing on that front. It's nice to hear, not just from the mouth of the AG, but from a governor and others to be able to say we're going to make that a priority. And y'all, we were able to go back a few years ago to be able to streamline death penalty appeals so that we could get justice more for those who were subject to the ultimate penalty. It's readily apparent to me that my first year as Attorney General, the first execution we had, I was 52, 53 years old. The person committed that crime when I was a senior in high school. That's not justice. That's not the way it ought to work, and they passed that. We needed significant reform in our parole system, and that's what you're supposed to say, amen, right? Because when we confronted the parole board about, is your goal to ensure public safety occurs as a result of those that are released? Or are you worried about prison population? They said prison population, not whether or not people were being able to be safe in the community. And our legislature responded. They flipped the script on what that looks like. And now when you have a prison population that's roughly 80% of those that are there for violent offenses, y'all, that tells me that's not a lot of people out to get out of parole, right? Because they haven't proven they can be safe in our community before. How are we going to be able to completely trust them to be able to say now? And so the fact that they took that issue on, I think is critically important. And again, thank y'all for that. And I look forward to those 10 families in our schools, right? So that's going to be something to be done. All right. Y'all, I could have told you that, and y'all have been AG now for 8 years. There's a reason for this gray area, maybe a little bit, and it's been a remarkable privilege. But when I walked into this job, I had never heard of the concept of preferred pronouns. Anybody else with me on that? All right, I didn't know there was a question that we were going to debate what gender you were. So I told you about COVID being a time where we saw a lot of stuff. I bought a Peloton bike. Anybody following that category? And it was asking me to fill out my information, my name and age, and then it came up gender, and I clicked the box and it said male, female, or non-binary. Y'all, I didn't know what that meant. I had no idea that there was a question of my gender being what was it on my birth certificate, as God conceived me in my mother's womb, and how I was born. But yet, suddenly, that is a point of contention in our country. And y'all, I think we're pretty clear in our state where we are, but I want to tell you how far we've had to fight that fight and why I found it a little bit strange. Because one of the things that y'all probably didn't follow, and unless you just sort of live in the world I'm in, one of the major victories for us for Alabama was keeping the Equal Rights Amendment from being a part of the Constitution. Now, Equal rights movement goes back to 1972. It came about when people wanted to amend the Constitution to be able to say very specifically language regarding equality involving sexes. Now, what I can guarantee you when the equal rights movement came about is that those that were for it and those that were against it didn't have a debate on whether you're a man or a woman. That was abundantly clear. That wasn't even a part of the discussion. But they had 7 years to be able to pass that constitutional amendment. You got to get 38 states, they needed 38. In fact, some states changed their mind after they passed it. But yet, Congress thought, well, maybe we'll give them an additional 2 years, but they still didn't get there. That thing sat dormant for years and years and years until early on in my tenure in the state of Virginia and the state of Illinois passed that amendment almost 30 plus years later, and suddenly they said, we're now, that's part of the Constitution. Anybody see one of the last press releases of the Biden administration where he said, the Equal Rights Amendment is now a part of the Constitution of the United States? Well, it wasn't, and that's because when Virginia tried to say it was, Alabama said you're wrong. And y'all, the left didn't even have Ruth Bader Ginsburg with us. And she was the renowned feminist lawyer on the board, and she said, if they want to get equal rights amendment, you got to start over again. And we sued, and we were able to, it was actually during President Trump's first term, we were able to get somebody called the archivist. I didn't even know there was an archivist, although it became prominent for the Biden administration, to be able to say, no, it's too late. You had a certain amount of time to do it, you got to start again. Those 3 Democratic states sued in the D.C. circuit. They got in front of Obama-appointed judges. We intervened so that Alabama conservative voices were heard. And y'all, they ruled against them. We felt really good about where we positioned Alabama to the point that Joe Biden can claim it, but why does that matter? Y'all, if in fact that had become a part of the Constitution, this radical gender ideology I'm going to tell you about would have had additional potential constitutional protections because we would have allowed the court to eventually decide what that term sex meant under that constitutional amendment. And y'all, I wouldn't have felt real comfortable about a California judge making that call. Or New York Second Circuit judge making that call. I'd feel really good about a Calhoun County judge making that call. But I wouldn't on those others, and it would have given protection to some programs I'm going to tell you about that we challenged that nobody in this room, I mean some of you, I believe many, would have believed you. So let me tell you about some of the fight that we had. When D.C. can't impose their will on states, how do they do it? With purse strings, right? Because if Alabama passes laws, which our legislature did strongly during this quadrennium, said boys are going to go into boys' bathrooms, girls are going to go into girls, boys are going to go into boys' locker rooms, girls are going to go into girls. They said boys are going to play against boys in sports, girls are going to go against girls. That when you have laws like that, they can't come in by sort of some other power and change the law that our legislatures passed and our governor signed. They try to do it by using the carrot and stick approach of federal dollars, and y'all, absent some of the litigation we would have, there are some hardships to deal with. So, let me tell you how they're trying to do it. Everybody here aware that we have a school lunch program that provides 3 months to low-income kids that need it. I think everybody, I don't care whether you're red, blue, whatever the color, defining your philosophy, everybody thinks you can make sure kids have nutrition they need so they're not hungry. They can learn better, have better lives. We support that program. The Department of Agriculture is the one that administers it. So during the Biden administration, they sent us a letter that said, Alabama, if you want to continue to be able to participate in that program, you're going to have to change your regulations to include not the word sex, but gender identity. And to include gender identity discrimination as an actionable way for somebody to sue the state of Alabama in order to accept that funds. Y'all, this is not a question of saying if the kid wants to identify this way or that way, that we're not going to to feed them. Nobody's done that. It wasn't, kid was hungry and wanted food, everyone had the opportunity to be able to get it. There was no discrimination there. This was a way of trying to get in the back door to be able to change Alabama law in a way they couldn't do it in the legislature. We sued, we fought back, and the judge said, the federal government, you're wrong. Next way they tried to do it was the WIC program. Everybody familiar with that? And y'all remember what it stands for, right? Women, infant and children. So that we're getting mothers who needed the opportunity to get appropriate nutrition for their babies. So the federal government said, we administer that through the Department of Public Health. And they said, all right, we're going to give you the money to be able to do the WIC program, but in order for you to receive that money, you have to tell us, number one, that you're going to accommodate the bathroom of the choice of the person who's visiting your Department of Public Health. So if somebody came in identifying as a woman, they can use the woman's bathroom. Identifying as a man, they use the man's. But they also said, what are you going to do to service the needs of breastfeeding and chest feeding parents? Y'all, I know I'm from Atmore. I may not have had the best education, but I ain't seen a chest feeding parent yet. Right? Right? But it was a way for the Biden administration to impose that ideology on Alabama as a result of the money that was coming in. We stood on that, and we were successful in being able to stop it. Title IX. Everybody here familiar with Title IX? A lot of discussion about that. Interestingly, the year that Congress passed the Equal Rights Amendment to be able to send to the states for ratification, they also passed Title IX. Title IX, bipartisan legislation, that said that women are going to have appropriate educational opportunities that are available to men. And they, in that enabling legislation, used the word sex. Y'all, when that was passed, there was no question of who was a man and who was a woman. And it was eminently successful in making sure that young girls had access not only to sports, which is where it gets most of its publicity, but also other educational programs out there that may have disadvantaged women in the past. Remarkably successful. So the Biden administration took on the mantle of the Obama administration. Because back during the Obama period, they tried to go into Title IX, and rather than change the law in Congress, which is the way you're supposed to change laws, they tried through something called a Dear Colleague letter or through new regulations to be able to open up bathrooms. And y'all, Alabama was one of the states that pushed back then, and we were able to get a federal order to say that the Department of Education has gone too far. You're not authorized to enter in this area. There's no statutory authority for what you're doing, and the states were able to stand down. And so in the Trump era, obviously that was not something that we were concerned about, and yet almost from day one, it was almost as if Joe Biden just said, hold my beer, here I come, right? If we're going to change this, and he did an executive order on day one that said he wanted this to be a priority for his administration. And they came out, it was a little over a year and a half ago now, with a proposed rule in which there were hundreds of thousands of comments that pushed back and said, this isn't the direction we want to go, but yet they decided to go with it anyway, and instead the rule had said, states like Alabama, you cannot limit sports in a way that you're doing it with boys against boys and girls against girls. It's how they identify. And you got to open up your locker rooms. They took away due process rights from those that were alleged to have done something wrong. And we're going to withhold money under Title IX funds for states that didn't accomplish it. It was a way of the federal government to overcome the laws that Alabama passed through a stroke of a federal pen. And we were able to push back on it. We led, it was 4 states for us here in Alabama. We filed in Birmingham. We had 28 attorneys general across the country join together to be able to come in, to be able to say that the Department of Education had gone too far. They were acting outside of their authority, and they were invading the province of the state to be able to make that decision. And the good thing is that right before the Biden administration came in the door, every federal court that considered it said that they had gone too far. And that we wanted, again, preserving integrity in women's sports. And you know, heard some on the left go, well, this is a solution looking for a problem. I can tell you, I got invited to the White House. It's been a couple months ago now. Was there to be able to see the signing of the executive order where President Trump made clear what we argued, which is that we're going to preserve the integrity for women and men in sports, and most importantly, the locker rooms and bathrooms in our schools and in our public buildings. And then a couple days later, I was at a meeting with Attorney General Bondi, who's a dear friend of mine, with a couple of AGs and some folks interested in this issue. And we heard from 5 young girls. One was a volleyball player from the state of North Carolina. Any of you that watched the State of the Union, you would have seen her there. She was a guest of the president. She had head trauma as a result of a male who identified as a female hitting her in the head during that volleyball match, and still suffers the symptoms from it today. But maybe as compelling as her testimony was 2 track athletes from the state of Maine. Everybody familiar with the story? Young man in 11th grade competes in the high jump, then he placed on the podium. Next year he shows up claiming to be a female and wins the indoor pole vault title, allowing his team to win the state championship by 1 point. And so one of the young women that spoke to us was a pole vaulter. And she talked about the early mornings in which she would get up and to practice, the late evenings where she would go work out, and she would be with her teammates to compete in a sport that she loved. And she missed being on the podium because he won and took her spot. And then there was another young lady that was on the second place team that finished that 1 point behind. Again, talked about all the work that she and her teammates had done to be able to get ready to be able to compete for their senior year. And as a result of him being able to compete in the women's event, but they didn't win the championship to be able to bring it back to their community. And y'all, probably not very different than Saxe or other small towns, but we put signs up, right, that say state champs this number of years. A point of pride for years and years to come. And she talked about how that felt for her. And so it shouldn't surprise anybody when we saw President Trump call out the Maine governor. Everybody see that? You know, about here we are, and here's what you've done, and here's what we're going to investigate. Well, it's for girls like that, it's the reason why. Because it's real and it matters. And not only is it an issue of fairness for women in sports, it's also an issue of health and safety for those participants that see it. Alabama's made it abundantly clear what our public policy is, and we stood by that. And the fact that we were able to win, I think, was a huge victory, if in fact we had not been successful with President Trump in the room. But maybe the most compelling victory of them all was one that we were able to champion just last week. And that is around the law that our legislature passed a few years ago, protecting kids from the radical experiment that's called gender affirming care. Y'all know what I'm talking about? All right, gender ideology from this administration is more than just simply kind of an effort to deal with imposing that on states and others. Y'all, it is permanently harming children. Child abuse. Now, I'm going to stop and say we're not going to do it. For those of you who don't know, it's where they allow a 12-year-old girl to do a testosterone shot once a week in her leg because she thought she wanted to be a boy. Or a young man to have a puberty blocker so that if he thought he wanted to be a girl, that there was not a transition, or even things as radical as surgeries on kids. You know, one of the strangest things I've ever seen was a gender reveal party for a 4-year-old. Think about that. Gender reveal for a 4-year-old. conversations I think I've ever had in my life was as we were initially beginning to defend Alabama's law that said, we're not going to do that in the state of Alabama. You're not going to use those drugs in that way. You're not going to do those surgeries. And if you do, you're subject to a criminal penalty. And UAB, by the way, was one of the places to do it. And had one of the preeminent doctors apparently out there in this world. But talked to a young man, he's in his 20s now, told me a story that when he was 12 or 13, he liked fashion, and he tended to hang around with girls more than boys, and he thought that just meant that maybe I need to be a girl and not a boy. Sucked into that world of gender affirming care. He gets into his late teens and early 20s and says, I didn't want to be a girl, I was just gay, and I didn't realize it. And now I look like a woman, and gay men aren't attracted to me because they don't see me. It was just like mind-blowing. But this young man is a victim of those who used his feelings at the time. Now, gender dysphoria is real, I acknowledge that. But it's a mental health condition to deal with. It's not one that we use shots and surgeries to try to be able to help kids. Alabama said, we're not going to do it. And it was the third state in the country to be able to pass a law. And I would tell you that it was a lift at the time because they were pushed back and said, Alabama, you're backwards to do this. Come on, just be a little more open-minded about what kids see. Because y'all, what parents were being told is your little boy who wants to be a girl is trapped into the body of a boy. Trapped. And we need to do everything we can to release that boy from that burden. The other thing they told parents, which is an absolute lie, is if you don't do it, Johnny or Susie's probably going to want to take their life. That it creates an enhanced suicide risk for a kid if you don't allow them to go through this gender affirming care. And y'all, that's a lie. And you proved it, it's a lie. And so, not long after we passed the law, Alabama gets sued. Not surprising from some of the usual players. What's interesting is they filed a lawsuit to begin with. They got a Republican judge, and they dismissed it. And it gets refiled. And interestingly, that Republican judge is a friend of mine. Initially said, Alabama, I'm going to join you. You can't move forward. Because what the other side did is come in and say, well, Judge, this is the standard of care. We have this organization called WPATH, which is an international organization that says, here's how we deal with transgender health. And if you want to be able to help kids, you got to really be able to take these shots, or you have to be able to let them take the surgery. And they put parents out there that were able to say, hey, these doctors told me this is what I need to do for my children, and this was the only resource that we had. And this judge, understanding, and I get the fact that parents' right to be able to dictate what goes on with their kids, said, well, maybe we need to put a halt on this for a little while. And disappointing, but I also didn't necessarily fault the judge because at that point in time, well, I didn't know what WPATH was. I knew it was an acronym out there with the national organization, but I didn't know the details. I have the American Pediatric Association saying this is what we need to be able to do. So it was understandable where the judge was coming from. But we had experts that said this is absolutely fundamentally flawed. And what's interesting is, y'all, this started in Europe. Y'all, when did we ever really follow Europe's lead as opposed to Europe following ours, right? I mean, isn't that kind of what that founding stuff I talked about earlier is about? And we saw the research coming out of Europe saying, this is not right. It's abusing kids. And, anybody Harry Potter fans? She was one of the most vocal advocates in our faith saying this is wrong what we're doing with kids. And she was vilified. Well, he still is in some respects overseas. And we just made the decision in Alabama that we're going to leave the fight against them. We were convinced that they were wrong, but y'all, they needed somebody to fight back to be able to expose them. And it got interesting. It meant not only to have all these well-funded groups from the outside, but we had Joe Biden and the Department of Justice come in and sue us alongside, which meant I had the entire weight of the federal government coming into Alabama with the resources they have, which is unlimited, to be able to fight this fight. And so your money, some outside lawyers to be able to help us. And we went down a contract over at the legislature. They make me come over there to get these things approved. And so it was a public record that we had a contract spent up to $500,000 initially on this. And I wondered, okay, is this the right use of taxpayer dollars? And I remember I was walking in the grocery store 2 days later, this woman walked up to me and she said, "Are you Steve Marshall?" And that's always scary, right? I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she said, "I saw that money you want to be able to spend for those lawyers." I was waiting for her. And she said, "If that's what it takes to protect our kids, that ain't enough." You know, that was a moment. I told you about that affirming thing you do for law enforcement when you were sort of acknowledge it next week. That was just a reminder for me that we were on the right path. And so what we did is to say, all right, if you want to sue us, then it gives us the right to know everything that you know. It's called discovery. Our judges in here know what a wonderful vehicle that is. But if you want to litigate a case, I get a chance to figure out what you know and what you believe. And we sent out subpoenas to that WPATH organization. And y'all, we were able to get their records. And their records had doctors going back and forth saying, you know, parents don't really understand this, and I don't have a way of being able to explain it because, you know, these kids potentially be sterilized, and that's the side effect of this. They don't understand the adverse impact of taking testosterone once a week for a young girl and what that means on the physical health for her later on. But that's okay, it's for the cause. And y'all, there's a fundamental principle in medicine called informed consent. And they're on the record saying that we don't even have the ability to explain to parents what it is they're about to get into and what this may do to their kids. We were able to get into their records to see that they had this chapter on the standards of care involved in units, which is part of that world. And y'all, the medical basis for being able to argue, be able to do this care for these kids was an internet chat room. It didn't have doctors, didn't have research. It was some fantasy-based computer site that they used to say is the standards for kids. And y'all, again, I ain't the brightest, but I figure I'm in a pretty good spot as a litigator if that's what they're going to be able to use against me and not research that shows us up as kids. And we were able to get into the Department of Health and Human Services. Remember the Biden administration sued us. And we said, all right, let's see what you know about this. Because anybody remember the name Rachel Levine? Okay. Second in charge at Health and Human Services, transgender pediatrician who talked about how great it was to be a parent, but yet he was going to deprive that of these kids. He was a man for a long time married and then changed later, but yet he was one of the leading proponents. And y'all, he's going back and forth with an email chain with his WPATH group saying, hey, we don't like several provisions because our lawyers, meaning these lawyers defending these cases, think you need to change it because they're not sure you can defend it in court. Okay, so we got lawyers deciding what medical standards of care are or aren't. And y'all, I don't think lawyers are trained in that regard, right? They should be defining what medicine is. But maybe here was the worst one. We at least had WPATH saying that before we're going to do surgery to change the body parts of boys and girls, that there ought to be an age minimum. And I can't remember whether it was 12 or 13, even one of those two. Rachel Levine writes back and goes, hey, we don't like the fact that you have those age minimums on kids. And the reason why is you put those age minimums there, it's going to hurt our political efforts in the transgender. Now this is second in charge of Health and Human Services. A pediatrician who supposedly has kids' best interests at heart saying, oh, don't put those age restrictions in place because it hurts our political agenda. You know, that's just wrong. It's absolutely wrong. And so we were able to be able to get into the underbelly of something that should have been every person who cares about kids. Because we already had a way of being able to treat these young people that suffer from genital dysphoria, but yet they were going another route, weren't following the protocols that even existed, and harming kids now. If you want to have an interesting reading, there's about detransitioners. People like Chloe, go back and read her story. Here's the pictures. So there's people that have followed what Alabama's done. And y'all, I would tell you that I think we uncovered a political and medical legal scandal that hadn't been seen in modern, at least American history. There was a commentator who follows this area who wrote, when historians look back and ask what led to the downfall of this medical pseudo-experiment on children, the activist decision to sue Alabama will be seen as their most significant blunder. Again, that's huge. And the only reason why we were successful is because you authorized and enabled me to fight on behalf of kids. And y'all, we didn't just fight on behalf of kids in Alabama. We fought on behalf of kids throughout the country. There's 26 states that have similar laws. And you had me the ability to fight on behalf of kids throughout the world. Because what's interesting is during that thing going on, there was something that you call the CAS report, which was a pediatrician in Great Britain that was tasked with studying all the research around gender-affirming care and say, is it something that I do? She came out with a blistering report that said this is bad for kids, it ought to be stopped, and we need to change every place in the world that's doing it. And now Alabama's on, we have a Trump administration that's issued an executive order that said this is not going to be something that we're going to do and fund in our country. And I think it's a huge win. And interestingly, that case, as of a week ago, is still going on because we have before the Supreme Court, it's the Tennessee law is before them, and the Supreme Court's going to rule not on whether or not the states can ban it or not like Alabama, but what standard of review the courts will use. So it's still an open question. But y'all, just last Thursday afternoon, the plaintiffs in the Alabama case dismissed it. Not because there's anything, not because the judge issued the order, but because we revealed the scandal for what it was, and they saw that their lies were exposed to a judge that I think would have held them to account, but also to a world now that says, stop doing this to our children. And so, y'all, when I'm done with public service, I'm going to look back on that as one of the best things that we had an opportunity to be able to do. Because sometimes you look, how far can we be able to make an impact? And this is one where you've allowed me, because of Alabama's courage, to be able to change the world. So, I think we're in a good place with the current administration on this issue. But we got to be able to win that case so we can make sure it's taken. So, y'all, we actually followed 200, not Alabama, but me and our Republican colleagues during the last administration. There were 200 cases against the Biden administration on multiple fronts. We won lots of issues that I think matter across our state, whether it be on the economy, whether it deals with energy resources, whether it deals on First Amendment protections relating to religious freedom or religious expression. But we got a new sheriff in town. No pun intended. And does it mean that we just sit back? No. It just means that we will adjust what we're doing. We've already heard about countless lawsuits that have been filed against the Trump administration already related to executive orders. I think Alabama has already been very proactive on the immigration front, supporting the effort of the administration to deport those that are here unlawfully, particularly those that are associated with violent gangs. You know, seemingly, we've had more attention paid to one previously reported illegally entered MS-13 gang member than we had protecting families about Lake and Riley, right? You'll see us continue to support the efforts of this administration see us again be active in those spaces in which we were pushing back against the Biden administration, trying to kind of hold the fort down, and we'll work to make sure that the Trump administration is able to get their policies and the people they need in place moving forward. And I bless the call came on to your friend. Appreciate already the efforts of the Department of Justice on what they're doing. But y'all, we have the ability to be able to support the Department of Education, Department of Health and Human Resources, the Department of Labor. Y'all, it's interesting, we even had, let me tell you this, a case that could have been filed against employers during the Biden administration because OSHA came out with some rules that said it's an unsafe work environment if you don't allow people to use the bathrooms of their choice or if you don't use the preferred pronouns of the employees. Again, that's how far they were willing to go. So, again, I think it's going to be a remarkably busy time, but again, one where Alan has voice is heard. So, God, be remiss if I didn't say again, thanks for what you allow me to be able to do, because it is a unique privilege to be able to fight these fights. If there's anything that Lynn and I have learned as prosecutors, it's okay to get a little bloody every now and then. That's what courtrooms are about, and to be able to stand firm even on those times where we may not win. We have an opportunity to be able to continue that fight with you. So, there's that. I'll be quiet for a while. Happy to answer your questions. Happy to. I'm going to grab that water. Yeah. Yes.
Now that you've been on both sides and at the state level, what's the biggest challenge our local district attorneys and enforcement officers are facing in today's world? What's the biggest?
I think I'll separate. I think very distributed to Lynn, I think I don't speak for the resources. I would imagine if she could hire 4 more prosecutors, she'd keep them all very busy and would work to be able to help produce. Y'all, COVID created a backlog in our criminal documents. And particularly, y'all, I'll give you an example. There's 140 plus people sitting in a jail in Montgomery right now, just waiting to be tried for murder. So it's not true here, but I would say there's probably still a backlog there. It's not because our judges ain't working hard enough, is there are only so many jury weeks a year. So I think, to some extent, very specifically, they are law enforcement. I mean, for DAs, it's a little bit of the resource of having a prosecutor do it. I think, big picture on the criminal justice side is fentanyl is devastating on multiple fronts. You know, one of the, I didn't talk about it tonight, one thing I'm proudest of work we've done, collected about 840 million, some of which is from y'all on the opioid crisis. A lot of that's driven down by the fentanyl side. I would imagine, Chief, Parsons, that fentanyl remains a significant problem on the streets and is a driver of a lot of the violent crime problems we're seeing. So I think that is globally one of the issues. And look, when you had a porous southern border, when the cartel was the driver of fentanyl across, then it shouldn't be surprising that we're seeing it. We see it in the loss of life, we see it in the criminal cases that are made, we see it in the violent crime that's there. I think that's a huge issue. So, yes, ma'am.
Good evening, Attorney General Marshall.
Ma'am, don't restate it. If you have a question, please ask the question.
Okay, all right, well,
Thanks.
I'll just do just the questions. So, since you are the chief legal officer and law enforcement officer for this state, could you please explain to me how you were morally able to support having a 34-time convicted felon and adjudicate a rapist in an oath of office, knowing that a felony conviction of a laundry list of crimes of moral turpitude will render a citizen of Alabama ineligible to vote?
I'll tell you how I feel about that person is I went to New York City, sat in a criminal courtroom there and watched a charade of criminal prosecution take place where there was no justice. It's a part of this. That wouldn't happen in the courtroom in Alabama, it wouldn't happen with a judge or a prosecutor here, and that showed how far the left was willing to weaponize the criminal justice system because they did not want him to go violent.
So at what point are we going to stop talking about Joe Biden and start talking Biden, not Trump. Joe Biden's not the president anymore. Trump is.
He wasn't the president, very blessed.
What?
He wasn't the president then either.
What's your next question?
All right. So you mentioned earlier that, I believe you said the Biden administration had tried to take away due process. That's exactly what Donald Trump is doing now. He's taking away due process. He's pulling people off the street and sending them to deportation centers without due process or a bit of habeas corpus. So how can you stand up there and say that you support Trump? I mean, if anybody doesn't have due process, then none of us have due process. I mean,
I would say you and I really disagree on lots of issues. I've already told you this again. I think your characterization of what the courts have done so far is incorrect. And I have complete confidence in our borders are, what ICE is doing, and that this administration, to the extent they're told to act differently by court of law, they'll follow. But y'all, there's no basis for how this administration dealt with the border over the last 4 years. We're having to deal with the crisis that was created by the Biden administration. And when you see the impact on the criminal justice system and the safety of communities around our country, I'm mighty darn glad that they're targeting violent gangs, previously reported illegals. Let me tell you how far Joe Biden is going here. Within the first couple of days of him being in administration, y'all, this is a program that we sent. The Trump administration had a policy that said, if you come into our country unlawfully, if you harm a child, you're convicted in the courts of the state, and you finish your sentence, we're going to deport you. Joe Biden set aside that program on day one. There's no justification for somebody like that being in our country, and I'm proud of the way that this administration is going to work. Absolutely. Here you go.
I've got a question that's always come to me, and I've always thought about this. And we're not having to deal with this, but since you know about other situations, I know this is gonna sound crazy. These men that want to be women and do their sports, why do they not have to have their penises removed, made into vaginas like they do for those, before they can go into a women's locker room? Why are they allowed to be, and this applies to men that go into women's prisons?
And look,
and
and
all those-
domestic violence shelters is there.
Yeah.
So, look,
Why
you
are
just
they
showed,
not,
you,
why is that not ever, do y'all ever bring that kind of stuff up?
I don't use quite the language that you use. To be honest, but y'all, it just shows you kind of why this is not the direction that we are in the country. And so let me just, a little bit tangent, y'all, I talked about UAV earlier. You know, we've seen DOGE has kind of exposed some of these grants. So UAV got a grant. I think it was close to $300,000 for it's hard to even say this, for a professor there to study transgender male vaginal health. Right? I mean, it doesn't even make sense. And so, there's a lot of reasons why, because of also what you described there. And look, I've spoken to many women that talk about this, but I had a chance to visit with Riley Gaines. You know, everybody's probably heard of Riley by now. But she described what it was like when that swimmer walked in their locker room and said, "Let's change." And they didn't even be able to have a seat. There was no surgeries that took place there. So, yeah, I think speak to it.
Because they're not really serious about being a woman if they have gone through which is certain.
All right, thank you. Any other questions, y'all? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for welcoming me here tonight. I would like to know what you know and your thoughts on House Bill 618 and who does that apply to?
He's looking it up. I'm looking it up.
So if you don't mind,
I
if
mean,
you'll hang,
six, eight,
if
ten.
you'll hang around a minute, I'll be glad to look at it, and we don't have to talk. That's okay.
Might see the stuff.
All right, y'all, thanks for letting me come, I appreciate it.
All right, thank you very much, we really appreciate you coming here tonight. And we know you're winding down on this, thing in your office, you're down. But I'd like to tell you that this group, this state, and the nation as well, we eternally grateful for the things that you've done. Bring honor, respect, and decency back to the country. You truly have a service heart. Okay, we're gonna make a group picture right here. We're not ready to adjourn. Anyway, when we get ready to adjourn, we'd like to group picture, whether we slide this down, slide the podium down. And then, we get this group picture, and you need to pay your dues, one part, two, and I think that's all we got. I really appreciate everybody coming out. It's good to see all the
I don't think that's it. I think it's the last thing we're going to contract with Calhoun foreign national here. I think, I feel like it hasn't come to the board or anything. We haven't finished. But it's been a while. But it hasn't done
Okay, Ken, I will tell everybody, we appreciate you coming. This is your first time here, so we're not worried about that.